Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, maybe some good evenings. Thank you for joining us. We're just going to give it a second to just let everyone trickle in through the system, and then we'll get started hearing about our webinar talking about just transition in steel and mining sectors. Okay, looks like that people are just joining, but I do like to reward the people that were here. So let's get going, and obviously we'll just be doing the opening bits now. So thank you for joining us for this webinar today, wherever you're joining from. So my name's Aimee Jackson. I'm the Director of Programs at Responsible Steel, and I'll be facilitating the webinar today. Really looking forward to sharing the findings of this project that we did, where we are pulling out our insights from the role of standards in steel and mining and driving a just transition. We will just move on to the agenda slide. So to kick us off, after we go through the logistical side of things, we'll be hearing from the leaders of our two organizations, this joint project between Responsible Steel and IRMA. Then we'll look at the project specifically. So why now? What were we trying to achieve? What did we cover? And what was the methodology that we followed. Then we'll dive into the findings from the work that was undertaken in this project, and you can see some of the highlights here. One of the key objectives was to make recommendations for voluntary sustainability standard systems, so we will cover those. We're going to deliver most of the webinar we're going to have a few different speakers going back and forth, and then we're going to leave some time for questions and answers at the end. But if you do have questions as we go through, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. That helps us keep track of questions and make sure that we get them all answered. At the end, when we come to the Q&As, if you want to ask a question directly, you can just raise your hand, and then we will unmute and hear your question. We are recording the webinar today, and we will be circulating it tomorrow. So I think you had to accept a permission to join, but you'll be able to catch up on anything that you missed. After we go through the Q&As, we will then talk about the next steps for the project and how we are going to take the recommendations forward. We'll move on to the next slide now, and just a reminder of our antitrust statement. And, of course, as ever, we need to be mindful of our antitrust policies, noting that both Responsible Steel and IRMA are committed to complying with relevant antitrust and competition laws and regulations. You can read our full statements here for each organization at these links and with these QR codes. Of course, if at any time you feel uncomfortable regarding any antitrust considerations, please do raise it, and we will make sure that we address it. So let's get into it. So I'm delighted to be joined by colleagues from Responsible Steel and from IRMA. So on the left, we have from Responsible Steel, our CEO, Annie Heaton. And then we have Haruko Hori, our standards manager at Responsible Steel, who was our lead for this project. From IRMA, we have Aimee Boulanger, who's the executive director there, and Davitso Muchawaya, the regional lead for Africa, who was IRMA's lead for this project. So really, Haruko and Davitso were leading this project, obviously, with support from their colleagues at their organizations. So without further ado, I will hand over to Annie to offer some opening remarks.
Thank you, Aimee. So hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to this webinar hosted by Responsible Steel and IRMA. And it's about a conversation that feels so timely because the transformation of our industries and economies is already underway, and it's already having the kind of social impacts that we had really hoped to avoid. But it's also essential because we all know that steel and mining provide the very materials that underpin modern economies. They shape our cities and power our infrastructure, and are they already providing the foundation for a cleaner economy in transport, energy systems, and so on. But as we all focus and focus on the urgent imperative to decarbonize our world, we've also got to recognize that this transition is not just about how quickly we achieve our targets. It's also about how well we protect the very people that are involved and impacted, the communities and indeed the environments. And we know that the decarbonisation transition, therefore, is not only one of materials and technology, and that goes also for transitions of digitalisation and supply chains. Those transitions are affecting people's jobs and livelihoods. They need new skills, need new locations, new technologies. They need new company strategies and new business models. So transition brings with it risks to everyone that has a stake. So there's a real imperative that we guide this transition to ensure fairness, inclusion, responsibility for all concerned, so that people that are impacted want to genuinely be involved in decisions that affect their livelihoods. And companies all along the value chain, they should want to be confident that they're assessing the risks to their business. A big part of that, and doing that well, is listening to stakeholder expectations and responding to those. The principles outlined in this report are really compelling evidence that actually there are diverse and strongly held views that really could create risks for companies that ignore this topic. But that also means that there are opportunities for those that manage them well. And actually, voluntary sustainability standards and certification is a really clear way to mitigate those risks. Now, this collaboration that this report represents between Responsible Steel and IRMA has been built on that recognition that we need to involve multiple stakeholders in the way in which these decisions are made. We need to do that transparently, and we need to embed a respect for the rights of the people impacted into every stage of our work. While IRMA operates at the mine site where raw materials are extracted, Responsible Steel focuses further downstream where those materials are transformed into the steel products. We share those common commitments of multi-stakeholder governance and transparency, and a focus on the social lens on how this impacts people. So this project has been a really great opportunity to bring these complementary value chain perspectives together and look for commonalities. And with this, we've done that with the support of the ISEAL Innovations Fund and the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs. And what we did was we set out to explore how voluntary sustainability standards can actually play a practical role in guiding industries through a responsible transition. So over the past year, this has involved a really quite an extensive amount of work, reviewing a huge amount of existing studies and frameworks, and also listening to the voices of stakeholders from across the world, of workers, unions, leaders in industry, community representatives, indigenous rights holders, NGOs, academics, and policymakers. And what we heard was clear, that a just transition is not a one-size-fits-all concept. It actually has to be tailored to context. It has to be grounded in dialogue, and it has to be responsive to the priorities of those people that are really directly affected on the ground, whether it's because their mine or their steel plant is closing or because a new one is opening up. But having said that, that is easier said than done. And especially in today's world when the economic pressures and climate timelines are so urgent. But that is exactly the kind of challenge that voluntary sustainability standards are designed to meet, because we bring together diverse perspectives. That's what we do we agree on shared principles, and we hold ourselves to account for meeting them. And that's the very DNA of what we do. So that's why we've come together. That's what we've been doing. That's what you're going to hear about more. What can you expect from the rest of this webinar? Well, we're not going to go into every detail on our findings, but we instead want to share the big picture, what we've learned from working together, and why we see the opportunities for voluntary standards to add value, and how we can take that forward. And we also want to hear from you and your feedback. So thank you for being here. Thank you to IRMA for collaborating with us on this project. And thanks to all of you for being part of this really important conversation, both today and in the work that we will continue to do.
Thanks, Annie. Great, and some great foreshadowing there of the content that we're going to be covering shortly. I'll now hand over to Aimee from IRMA to welcome us from the IRMA perspective.
Thanks so much, Aimee. Thank you, Annie, and thank you all for coming today. It's such an honor to have the opportunity to work with Responsible Steel. And as Annie said so well, really think about not just one piece of the puzzle, but to really yoke together a whole supply chain of materials from where they are extracted from the earth and the people who are impacted by that and the people who are working and the industries there, all the way to the end products that are in our lives every day. So coming from the IRMA perspective, focused on mining, we look at the fact that mining provides materials that most of us use every day. It's in our phones, in our buildings, cars, transit, computers, jewelry, more. And extracting those materials is hard work. We rely on a mining industry globally to provide materials that we are using in these everyday products. But that work also comes with significant impacts, and all of us using those things, and some of us using disproportionate amounts of them, are complicit in that. We have an opportunity and a responsibility to look at the impacts that come with the consumption of these goods and the materials that go into them, and to look at how do we create value for our mining industry and those who process those materials and make them into these end products to do good. How do we create market value for environmental and social responsibility? And in particular at this time where we're focused on just transition. As Annie spoke so well to, the mining sector and mineral processing and steel are in this moment of significant change. We see pressures quickly growing and changing on market demands, increased scrutiny on the mechanization and digitization, and it's reshaping how our communities are looking at their lands, at economic opportunities, at jobs, and how workers experience their daily lives going in. And when we look at the idea of just transition, as we look at issues like cleaner technologies, jobs which may be thousands of kilometers away in countries around the world are not just a simple shift for many. There are disruptions, there's uncertainty, even as we work for long-term gains for the quality of work and environmental gains. When IRMA was founded 20 years ago now, it was brought together by a diverse set of people who agreed that they would co-create a system that they would equally govern to together seek to define what is best practices in responsible mining, and to create value for every participant in that, whether it was Indigenous rights holders looking at their rights to free, prior, informed consent of what happens on their lands, or workers feeling safe and well compensated when they go to work, or the industries who are doing that work. We want to ensure that they're seen value for environmental and social responsibility, and that the legal systems and market systems create a positive feedback for that. So as Annie spoke so well to, today's discussion is really looking at how do standard systems like Responsible Steel and IRMA help to guide that forward. When Haruko and Davidzo share with you more, we can see that there at times were a diversity of perspectives on this topic, and at times divergent perspectives, and at times also a lack of clarity of what specifically do we do to mean just transition. But we know standard systems try to create the guidebook to getting through these difficult things, the specificity and the requirements and the guidance, and then the assurance of verifying that actual progress is being made on the ground. And so that was our question back to ourselves. How can Responsible Steel and IRMA work together to ensure the rights of workers and communities and the opportunity for business to find value are yoked together in our own standards? And we do that work with your input and feedback. So we welcome your questions here and your guidance to us as we step in and share with you what we've learned so far in this project. So thank you again.
Thanks, Aimee. And thanks again, Annie. I think that was really great framing of the session. So I'm actually just going to suggest we go straight into it. And I know both of you have touched on, why now? Why is this important now? But I think, Davitso, if you can just give a little bit more context on why are we focusing on this now, and then maybe outline also the project objectives specifically.
Yeah, thank you so much, Aimee. And Annie has done quite a great job in terms of providing the context of why we worked on this project, but I'm just going to go into some specific details here. When we started working on this project, this was a question that we needed to answer. Why now? Why does it matter? Why do we have to work on this project? When we looked at the mining and steel production industries, together they are responsible for an estimated 14 to 16% of global emissions. So these are sectors that are at the heart of transitions, and it was important for us to really look into it as voluntary sustainability standards. Decarbonization, as Annie has said, is gaining momentum. Companies are moving very fast to reduce emissions as part of their climate targets. There's quite a lot that is happening. Adoption of green technologies, innovations, all this to race to meet climate targets. But when we look at social protection safeguards, we realize that this is lagging far behind. The protections that are needed for workers, communities, and indigenous rights holders are not keeping up pace with the momentum of decarbonization. And without deliberate action, there is a real risk that men will be left behind, workers will be displaced from jobs, and communities will be burdened with impacts of change without sharing any benefits. So where does voluntary sustainability standards come in? We realize that standards play a very powerful role. And as Annie has said, we provide clear expectation and guidance to companies. We offer accountability mechanisms for communities and workers to hold companies accountable. And we also provide support for the protection of workers, affected communities, indigenous peoples during transitions. And first with these realities that I've just said, that Annie is also attributed to, our project set out with a very clear agenda. The project had two main objectives. The first one was to clarify how standards can enable socially responsible transitions in the steel and mining sectors. And secondly, we had to work on a proposed practical framework which standards can then adopt and implement. And as we worked on this, it was a journey, a very interesting one that was marked with very distinct steps that were interesting, that were characterized by questions, some which we could answer and some which we could not answer.
Great. Thank you, Davitso. So I'm going to hand over to Haruko to share with us how we approached this question and the methodology that we followed.
So thank you, Aimee. So I'm going to go through briefly, the journey that we have been coming to this day, and then we wanted to go through how we conducted our project so far. So this project, we started with a quite profound literature review with over 200 sources, including the online material that's available, and that was really helps us our initial understandings and also framing the just transition topic, and then also challenges and issues around that. And that in that process, we quickly identified a few key guiding documents, including the ILO Just Transition Frameworks, UN Working Group of Business and Human Rights Recommendation, and also academic justice theory. And those all together serves as the basis of initial mapping frameworks. And with that frameworks, we further mapped against existing 16 just transition frameworks with different background, business, but also academic and international, national, different diverse frameworks. We looked into it. And also 10 existing voluntary sustainability standard systems. So what we tried to do in that process was that we looked into each existing just transition frameworks to see what area are commonly covered, what are missing, and then testing against our initial mapping frameworks, and then missing area was incorporated into our initial mapping framework. And then that process resulted in our draft just transition frameworks. And then we moved into the stakeholder engagement phase. We conducted 35 in-depth interview with those who had in-depth knowledge and expertise in the topic of just transition. And that really helps us to understand gaps and alignment. And then that helps us to design our further in-person workshops. One is in Johannesburg in South Africa in May. Another one is in Brussels in June. So that together really gather a lot of information and about our testing testing our frameworks, but also our methodology, how strong it is and how robust it is. And then with those collected together with those framework feedbacks, we adjusted and then our just transition frameworks into the final just transition frameworks. So in this process, it took us 1 year so far. It's really a lot of work put it into this process, and we try to really conceptualize what just transition means to us. And this process really highlighted and then made us understand that transition as business as usual are not the same as just transition. So.
Great. Thank you, Haruko. And thanks for outlining the methodology. There was a tremendous amount of work covered in this project, and having the 12 principles and moving those to 9 I know it wasn't as simple as deleting 3, right? It was consolidating and removing and adding, as well as going from what looks like just removing one criteria from the literature review to the new one, but it was much more complicated than that, and interesting that we ended up with quite similar numbers.
Yeah.
Which will be shared in the report. So we'll now move on to the findings of the project, having followed that methodology. And as we go into this, I just wanted to emphasize one concept, which is we've all heard the phrase or the collection of words just transition. It seems to be very, very trendy right now. It's something where you're not always sure if someone is just saying just transition because they heard someone else say transition, so they put the word just in front of it. So we felt that it was important to stop and decouple these two words, which was a real emphasis that we heard in the engagement with stakeholders, which is, let's make sure that we are considering the justice component of just transition, not solely adding the word just in front of the word transition. So we've developed this very complex diagram to help emphasize this point. It's obviously a simple but important point. So with that, we're going to move on now to talking about the two pieces, and we're going to start with transition. But obviously we've written transitions here. So Davitso, can you share a bit more about why we're using a plural for transition?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we started working on this project, I would, I laugh with Haruko and ask, do we call this transitions or do we call it transition? And then we would correct each other back and forth. But as we go deeper in discussions with stakeholders, they made one thing very clear to us. that they are going through multiple transitions, decarbonization, automation, mine closure, new mine developments, supply chain reconfigurations, and many more. So they're indeed going through transitions and not one transition. So in the report, we make it very intentional. We speak about transitions and not one transition. So each of those transitions has its own impact pathway. Some have got a peculiar geography, but one thing is very common. Within all those transitions, there are those who benefit and there are those who are left to bear the cost. And while these overlapping transitions continue to reshape the mining industry, the steel industry, in communities, there's one central issue, one central question that emerged. That was the question of justice. As stakeholders kept on asking, what about justice?
Great, thank you, Tabitha. And I think it is worth just noting that or emphasizing the point about it being beyond decarbonisation, because some of those frameworks that I know that we were first looking at in the literature review do tend to focus on the green transition. And it's what we heard very clearly from stakeholders is there are a lot of transitions happening, so let's not limit it just to this one. So thank you for laying that out. So we're going to move now to Haruko, who will share more on what we found regarding the justice side of the equation.
Yeah, thank you so much. So the justice side. So from the stakeholder engagement, we really hear so many times that the justice element is not at all, but rather it's the core of just transition concepts. But in the current practices, the justice element is often forgotten. So, and then also justice as in a term of justice is quite abstract and a vague concept. So what it means is really different from different people. So we use justice theory to breaking down what it means. This justice theory then allowed us to understand what justice element is we are talking about. And also that ensure us to cover those different aspects in our frameworks. So I'm gonna go briefly with you. This on the right-hand side, there's a diagram. So I wanted to go through a bit of justice theory with you. So the top round, there is procedural justice. So this is about process of transition should be fair and justice. So that means that how the decisions are made and then who should be at the table of decision making. And the left-hand side, the circle, distributive justice. So when you think about transition, there's always cost and a benefit. So who should be access to the new opportunity, like worker, new job opportunities, but also upskill, reskilling opportunities, and also who should be paying the cost for transitions. That's that quite big question there. And on the right-hand side, restorative justice. This is really about past harm, but also ongoing harm as well. So how shall we address those ongoing and then past harm? Again, this is very difficult area to address, but this is the sort of picture of just transition, justice theory to capture different aspects of element of justice. So I would like to introduce one remark from the one Indigenous leader we had a chance to spoke with during the interview. So he shared with us, quote, just transition is very confusing term. He was saying that it doesn't reflect the realities they face. Basically, they're saying that their way of living is already very sustainable, yet they are disproportionately affected by the transition. So the key question here is, to whom shall the transition be just? And this, I think, operationally, this means that when we define justice, we really have to understand the reality of the stakeholders. So when we define justice, we have to co-create, co-design together with workers, communities, and indigenous people who are affected by it. And right and equity must run through every decision.
Great. Thank you, Haruko. So let's now move to finding a little bit more about what we learned, having set up the justice theory framework and the other frameworks for the principles. What are we finding on the ground, Davidso?
Yes, and here's what we are seeing on the ground. We are seeing that there are a number of transition frameworks that are in existence, but the implementation is very inconsistent. As has been said, social safeguards lag far behind technological advances. So you have policy frameworks, regulatory frameworks, technological advances, moving forward in a much faster way. But measures designed to protect workers and communities from harm are not doing the same, so they are not keeping up with the pace. Stakeholders also shared with us that there's a big gap between the commitments that are made by governments and what gets done on the ground. We know that governments do make commitments, and they have been making just transition commitments. And we looked at quite a number of jurisdictions and the number of governments and the work that they are doing in the space. But we also noted that the planning and resourcing of these commitments is not always there. So the resources are lacking, but commitments are there. The focus is usually on technology, while protection for communities and workers are left in the shadows. And depending on the policy context or institution, labor relations, the story can look very different. So even in a country, you might have, disparities in different communities. And there are also differences from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. We learned that the delivery of protections and safeguards is highly dependent on institutional capacity, policy coherence, and the quality of stakeholder engagement. And I would like to underline stakeholder engagement here because stakeholders emphasize that stakeholder engagement is important, but it has to be very meaningful. So when you look at all those points, they point us to a very big picture or a big issue, which is the gaps between policy and practice. I'm going to touch on a little bit on the gaps that we noted on policy and practice. There are many gaps in practice between policy and practice, but we identified 6 that continue to recur. And the first one that we noted is on policy fragmentation across government levels. So this was very glaring, and this is not limited to any particular jurisdiction. You find this in Global North and Global South. So it's something that cuts across different governments that there's policy fragmentation, and is an issue that is recurring. And when it comes to stakeholder engagement, we noted that there's a gap as well. Stakeholder engagement often happens very late in the process or in the transition process, with communities and workers being involved later on, and their input does not really result in influencing decisions that are made, or they are brought in to rubber stamp the decisions that would have been made a long time ago. We also noted that there's a gap in weak value chain collaboration. So whilst collaboration is happening, it is very weak, and it's not happening in many jurisdictions, for example. We also noted that there's a gap when it comes to worker reskilling, specifically misaligned reskilling efforts. So companies and governments are training workers, but they are training workers in some cases for jobs that do not exist. And we had the opportunity to speak to quite a number of labor representatives. And one of them told us that reskilling should always be looked at as a headline, but redeployment should be looked at as the lifeline. So in essence, they were saying that there's need for pathway for workers to get jobs and not just issuing them with certificates. And another gap that we noted, and this has been a recurring theme during our discussions, was insufficient support for vulnerable groups. And I think we have been speaking about this in this webinar as well. And lastly, FPIC was very topical. So free, prior, and informed consent was very topical. And the gap that we noted was that currently in transitions, FPIC is very procedural. As Aruko has alluded to, there are so many questions that Indigenous communities ask. You know, one of the things they ask is about the processes that are followed when FPIC is being done. More often than not, they say that it's being done as a tick box exercise. That is not meaningful and does not result in them influencing decisions. So the gaps that I've identified and many more highlight why stakeholders' perspectives are important, because with stakeholders' perspectives, they bring us into the nuances and lived experiences of workers and communities.
Absolutely. Thank you, Davitso. I am going to hand over to Haruko in just a moment to hear a little bit more about those stakeholder perspectives. But I just wanted to remind everyone that if you have questions as we're going, we're covering a lot of content. So if you do have questions as we go, just a reminder to add your questions into the Q&A box, and then we'll try to come to them at the end. But as you say, Davitso, understanding how this is happening on the ground requires different stakeholder perspectives. So Haruko, can you share with us what we were hearing from the different groups?
Yes, definitely. So as Davitso explained to you earlier, it's really just transition. It's very context specific. And to understand the priority, we have to understand what they see as an important priority for them as well. So reality is really important aspect that we have to understand, and then issues around that. So I'm gonna highlight few groups. But we sorry, the slide space. Sorry, I didn't change that. Oh. Yeah, sorry, that was right. I'm sorry. So I'm just gonna go through a few groups to highlight their perspective. So the first, workers' organization, their perspective is really around job securities. So that's include decent job, safe work, but also opportunity of upskilling and reskilling. And they're looking at more workers' direct impact. On the other hand, when we talk about and when we look at the literature around human rights groups, they're looking beyond the workers' impact. So they're looking at more community aspects, including tripart social dialogue, and also FPIC, the indigenous communities' right as well. And then the indigenous people themselves, they are actually requiring much more transformational changes, meaning that they really require stakeholder-driven engagement and stakeholder-driven decision-making. So that's the FPIC really implies that, but also they are as a partner of the transitions, they want to be part of the decision-making. So that is the different perspective. So that this really show that different stakeholder groups has different priorities, and that also require different level of social dialogue and engagement. So that was very interesting and also important to understand for us. But there are also some areas of strong agreement as well. So I wanted to introduce that element as well. So one of the area of agreement between different stakeholders is social dialogue as a very important key aspect to enable just transition. So in fact, this social dialogue came up every single framework that we looked at, that was all covered in that framework. And also agreement of importance of well-being and social protection of workers and communities. And then lastly, indigenous rights, and then not only indigenous people's right, but also vulnerable and marginalized communities' right and care. So that was the agreed area that we found.
Great. Thank you very much, Haruko. And I think, just to emphasize, a real strength of this project was the dialogue with all of these different groups to make sure that we were hearing all the different perspectives. So great job summarizing what we were hearing from each of those groups. But as Aimee mentioned at the beginning, there wasn't total alignment on all of these things. So I'll hand to Davitso to hear where there were areas of maybe less agreement.
Yes, yeah. So there were some aspects of the discussion where there was no consensus. And to spotlight two of those areas where there was no consensus, and the report makes that very clear. So one of the issues where there was divergent views was on defining just transition. So the question that was asked was, is it in the place of voluntary standards to define just transition? What, just transition means? Some stakeholders argued that, yes, it is in the place of voluntary standards to define just transition, because if they do not do that, communities and workers will be left with vague commitments, and there will be no way to measure progress. And to highlight this, one civil society representative that we spoke to was very clear and stated that we must co-create a shared definition with industry stakeholders so as to avoid implementation paralysis. But others were very cautious that a fixed definition could miss the local realities or impose a single view. So these were the realities. We did not land on this one. However, what the report does is that it provides guidance from what we heard from stakeholders on what an acceptable definition would include. And that would include a definition that is practical, a definition that offers protection to workers and communities, a definition that goes beyond decarbonization, and a definition that is not prescriptive. So with that, we have also made it very clear in the report that we do not provide a definition of just transition, but what we do is that we provide guidance from what we heard from stakeholders. And the second big debate was around historical reparations. This was very interesting because there was a divide even within civil society as well as mining companies on whether just transition should include accountability for past harm. The debate was around should the just transition agenda include past harm, or this should not be in the scope. So for some, specifically Indigenous rights holders and historically marginalized groups, the answer was a firm yes. Their argument was that you can't separate justice from history. So definitely voluntary standards should include historical reparations. But others were worried that voluntary standards should not be expected to handle the topic of reparations, as they would be going beyond their mandate. Additionally, they also raised that there was a risk that adoption by mining companies and steelmakers would be less likely if the topic of reparations is included as part of the just transition framework. And we're also faced with a very practical question, which was then, should standards include concrete requirements on reparations? Having gone through those discussions, or should we just focus on immediate social impacts on decarbonization? Again, we did not land on this, and the report does not provide answers on this. We realize that these are tensions that standards hold, and it was very clear to us that these tensions are not going away, and standards cannot ignore them. And what these discussions did was that they underlined for us the complexity and diversity of views surrounding just transition, and also pointed us to areas where guidance is important.
Great, thank you, Davitso. So some of those conversations I remember from the workshops were really really interesting. And where we saw the consensus, that was easier, but it was also great to see the willingness of the different stakeholder participants to engage in recognizing that they were representing different perspectives. And, you know, I think we've done well here to highlight that there is not at the highest level agreement on some of these, but it really emphasizes the point that has been made a few times about the importance of the context specific considerations. So we can't necessarily define each of these things at the highest level, but we can actually make sure that in the application of the development of the standard for the sector that we're operating in, but also then the application of the standard, we can make sure that we're considering those specific context considerations. So let's keep going. So we've shared some of the key findings in terms of the literature review and what we were hearing from stakeholders. And if you'll remember that one of our objectives of the project was to come up with recommendations for voluntary sustainability standards systems in how they can apply the learning of these frameworks and criteria that we've developed. So I'm going to hand to Haruko to walk us through how we translated all of this into a framework.
Yes, thank you. So I'm going to go through briefly the principal recommendation. So as you remember, started with draft just transition framework that was adjusted by the feedback that we receive. And we are now having this final just transition framework, which includes 9 principles. And within that, sub-listed 52 quite extensive criteria in that framework as well. And those are grouped into right and equity. You can see on the left-hand side on the top, and procedural justice element, and distributive justice, and then distributive justice, and then restorative justice elements. So I'm going to go through each element briefly with you. So in right and equity elements include formal commitment to just transition principle and human rights standards. In fact, this is really quite strongly agreed among different stakeholders. Everyone agreed on importance of this right and equity. And the second one, procedural justice, includes inclusive governance and planning transition activities with social dialogue, and also just transition plan in place to mitigate social impact. This also element is quite agreed by stakeholders, and we understand that this is a core of the just transition framework as well. And then distributive justice elements include decent work, skill development, but also protection and support for affected community throughout value chain. So it's the value chain wide protection and support. And lastly, as David's already mentioned, restorative justice is included in our framework. We understand it's contested area, but indigenous people's rights, self-determination, partnership, and then reparation, but also environmental legacy and restoration is part of the restorative justice. And from our mapping exercise, we understand that there are some areas that are well covered in existing just transition frameworks, but there are others that are less well covered. And as I said, restorative justice element and also partly value chain wide support and protection are less covered. But we came to this, our framework, based on what we believe are important. So we include in this all together in the final just transition framework, regardless of the level of coverage in the current existing just transition frameworks. So it might be aspirational to some organizations. It might be challenging, but at least we hope this framework helps us to establish our criteria, new requirements on just transition for our journey. But also, I hope this framework support other voluntary sustainability standard systems in achieving and advancing just transition journey.
Great. Thank you, Haruko. And to emphasize, I think this looks so simple now that it's down in one place, but to emphasize the work that was done to pull this all together. And I really like the flow about starting with the commitments to principles and human rights standards and flowing into the inclusive planning to come up with the plan, and then talking about the elements that should be considered in the development of that plan. And to emphasize that there are 52 criteria that further back up this framework, but we thought we would spare you that on a slide and leave that as a teaser for when the report comes out very soon. So this is the framework that we've now talked about. But David, so what does this mean for voluntary standard systems? What recommendations are you making?
Yeah, so from the discussions that we had, 5 themes stood out, and these are governance, how principles are developed, implementation support, assurance systems, and collaboration. And from this, we identified 5 key recommendations for voluntary standards. The first one is transparent and inclusive governance. So this recommendation is very important because it speaks to power in the way voluntary standards are governed. So who holds power, who makes decisions, who participates, who is represented, and how the decisions are shared with stakeholders. Stakeholders told us that voluntary standards, that you've got governance models that include all key stakeholders, that are transparent, that are inclusive, and you've got balanced representation, you've got better outcomes. So this is one recommendation that we've made. And the second one is inclusive development of principles and requirements. As we've been speaking throughout the webinar, we have been alluding to inclusive participation of communities, participation of workers. And as a recommendation, we are also making this recommendation that the development of principles has to be done with communities and workers. So workers and communities have to co-create. Workers, communities, as well as business as well, have to co-create the principles that are included in standards. And this has to be done through a transparent and inclusive process. So, for example, co-developing definitions, as we have seen, that can be a very challenging process, but it's one that needs to be done. Co-creating terminologies and then agreeing on principles as well as practical matrices. And recommendation number 3 relates to the support for implementation. So this basically relates to how standards come up, make it easier for companies and business to implement requirements. So there's need for support to provide support to implementers so that they can have clear guidance on what needs to be done or what good looks like. So support can mean providing clear tools, guidance documents, training, and feedback to implementers. And for topics such as FPIC or grievance mechanisms, there may be need to provide practical guidance to show implementers on how to get it right, because this is not very easy and it's very difficult. And recommendation number 4 is very important as it relates to assurance systems. The credibility of standards rests on strong assurance systems. So without strong assurance systems, businesses, communities, and workers will lose trust in voluntary standards. And we recommend that audit outcomes need to reflect the lived experiences and voices of workers and communities so that they can trust the system. They can trust that the assurance system has got the ability to represent what they are actually going through as they go through transitions. So there's need to build capacity of auditors. Many standards do not currently have training programs specifically on just transition. So there'll be need for capacity to build auditors so that auditors have got the right expertise in auditing just transition. And they're also able to assess local realities sensitively. And when it comes to consultations that is done by auditors, there is need for transparency, and transparency should be before, during, and after audits. We clearly heard from standards from mining companies that standards must specify what good practice look like, and not just stating good intentions. So this is very important. And lastly, collaboration. One of the key recommendations that we make in the report is that voluntary standards need to collaborate because they do not work in isolation. So that would be collaboration amongst peers. So peer-to-peer collaboration amongst voluntary standards, collaboration with other organizations that are already working in the just transition space, collaboration with governments themselves, because this is also a very critical area, and how collaboration with governments would look like might mean voluntary standards sharing resources on just transition, standards also sharing resources that governments can use to benchmark their policy frameworks as well as their legal frameworks against, because standards usually they've done quite a lot of work and they've got expertise in just transition as they go through different revisions. So when we were making recommendations about collaboration, we're looking at collaboration not as competition, but collaboration is building synergies, sharing practices, and leveraging effort. And with that, I hand over to you, Aimee.
Great, thank you, Devito. And I think what's interesting about the recommendations here is it's kind of taking the different components that make voluntary sustainability standard systems such a unique and important and effective tool. So starting with the transparent inclusive governance, which multi-stakeholder standard systems are governed by, thinking about the principles and requirements, but then really thinking about how are we supporting the implementation of that, and how are we verifying it. So this is where that gap between policies and practice, we really have an opportunity to use standards to close that gap, particularly with the assurance piece. And with this project, it was a really excellent demonstration of collaboration between two standard systems, and we really saw fantastic collaboration with all of the stakeholders that we engaged with. Okay, so that was a good summary of the findings, and we are going to now move into questions. I should have mentioned at the beginning, actually, we had some really interesting questions come through in the registration for the webinar. So thank you for those of you that submitted them if you are here, and it helped shape the content of the webinar to make sure we were responding to your questions. There were some additional ones which we haven't yet covered, and we're gonna actually touch on now. And then others that were possibly more relevant for potentially other webinars. So for example, a couple of questions about interoperability, which we have other resources on and love talking about, but we're gonna keep these focused on just transition now. So I'll start with actually, sorry, the other thing I should say is that we also received some specific questions about examples of countries or sectors or sites where transitions are happening that are not perceived to be just, or that sort of thing. We're going to focus, this project really focuses on the processes that standard systems should follow. So we won't be commenting on the actual scenarios, but we hope that this will plant seeds about how we could use tools like standards to help address some of those challenges that you're observing. So, and I can see the questions coming through in the chat. Thank you very much. And we will try to get to as many of them as we can. I'm going to start with a combination of one that came in before and one that has come in now, which is asking, and I'll come to you for this, Annie, asking about how does this impact someone as a director and their board. and touching on the role of leadership and change management within this concept and within these sectors.
Sure, sorry, just trying to unmute there. It's a really important perspective, because I think if we're looking at the levers of change, there's been a lot of focus, hasn't there, in the last 10, 20 years on the role of boards in driving all aspects of sustainability. And, you know, boards increasingly have a sustainability expert on the board, and their role is, I think, to a large extent, to really educate the board on what this means in practical terms. You know, in a generic sense, if a board, one of the responsibilities of a board is to its investors to ensure the long-term value of the company, then the responsibility of the board is to ensure that the management of the company is managing its risks. And when you look at the kind of risks involved in the transition, yes, you've got huge technological risks involved with, for example, in steel, switching from coal to hydrogen. But you've also got big stakeholder risks, which will affect operations. It could involve the costs of disruption, of worker discontent, for example. So the board has got to be cognizant of how well the management is actually looking at those stakeholder risks, listening to stakeholder perspectives, incorporating those stakeholder perspectives into their transition plans, and genuinely engaging, because I think we know, and this has been highlighted in the research, that that kind of tick box approach to stakeholder engagement doesn't actually get you to a place that is less risky from a board's perspective, right? So I think that's an important part of it. And then, you know, the question I think was also in the chat was around what's the role of leadership management within the sector, and how do we engage those in the positions of authority, but also what's the role of finance? And those things connect, because I think investors increasingly play a really important role in engaging with the board, and therefore the board has to engage with the management on these kind of questions, critical questions. So, you know, we've seen the Equator Principles, which is a risk-lensed kind of framework, really bring sustainability issues to the fore over the years. The IFC principles, for example, but we need to get more specific to the kind of risks that are involved for particular sectors. We've seen that in the climate transition debate. Investors have had to get really under the bonnet of what does it mean for the cement sector or the steel sector, or the electronic sector, for example. So you've got to get specific. And when you look at the steel transition, it's a value chain transition. And it's not just about the steel plant, it's about where does the energy come from, where do the minerals come from, how are those input materials going to change over time. So, and therefore, what does that mean for the supply chain? What does it mean for the new communities that will be involved? What does it mean for the communities that were involved, and perhaps the economic activity may move away from them? What does that mean for the rest of the company? So that whole value chain perspective is quite specific, I think, to heavy industry, and it's or rather, each industry has its own specific value chain perspective. So the kind of work that we've done here, I think, is something which I would really hope boards would embrace, to be able to use as a kind of tool, perhaps to guide and frame the leadership within their companies in the work on guiding a low risk transition, if you like, from that kind of that business perspective. And I very much hope that finance will also embrace this kind of work, because I think it really serves to strengthen the work that's already been done with, as I say, the Equator Principles and so on, and the work that's going on the climate transition plans, to really build it out and provide that perspective on actually how is this affecting people, and actually what does that mean for our business. And it's not just about risk, it's also about opportunities. It's about really doing this well, and where the opportunities come from in that. So I think as we go to the next stage for responsible steel in this project, and we start to talk to our members about how we can incorporate these principles within our standard, or rather strengthen them within our standard, I think that's where the conversation is going to be really educational. And we would be appealing to leaders within steel companies and our other members to look at how they can use these principles within their companies. Aimee, perhaps you'd like to build on that from the mining perspective.
Well, that was really well said, Annie. I agree with all of it. I mean, on IRMA's side, we are governed by 6 houses of stakeholders. The finance and investment sector is one of those 6 houses of governance who are our bosses. Earlier this year, we were in Europe meeting with a leading bank in Europe, and their leadership were saying to us, look, one of our largest new portfolios of investment is in minerals associated with energy transition and the infrastructure that goes with that, like the steel sector. And they said it's both the largest new investments we're doing, and nothing we're doing is as risky as that. That is the riskiest thing we're doing right now, and yet we're stepping into this more than we are anything else. And it was just such an affirmation of what we often talk about, which in many mining companies, steel companies know this now, but there is no supply chain security without community consent. And when I say community consent, I'm speaking to the workers, as well as the people who live closest to these operations, as well as Indigenous rights holders, and particularly in places where we're saying we're going to bring new extraction and industry. There is no supply chain security without the consent of these communities of people, because as long as we have conflict, litigation, blockades, strikes, violence increasing, we're not going to have systems that work. And so we have this opportunity now where the finance sector can be leaning in, and leadership in other places to inform the strong role of law, because voluntary systems like IRMA and Responsible Steel will never replace the key role of law and government, right? We can be a permission slip to increase laws. We can be a demonstrator of value that comes with stronger laws, that regulatory cohesiveness and comprehensiveness isn't a regulatory burden on good business. It's an insurance policy for good business. You know, by doing audits of business in a range of different countries, you can show high performance in places where human rights are protected by governments, right? Where worker health and safety is protected by government. And it becomes a market-based permission slip for there to be cohesive regulation and laws. And often because mining and extraction in the industry and processing it has brought in a strong financial and tax base to many countries, you had some governments encouraged to look the other way, right? Don't regulate because this is going to bring in your financial well-being. Well, it's an opportunity now for us to be really clear in saying, do regulate and create value, market value, reputational value, legal value, permitting value for environmental and social responsibility in these businesses, so that we make sure we have the right market signals to the private sector. Otherwise, what mining company or steel company can make the case to their own leadership to invest more in those things unless we see governments affirm that and markets affirm that when people and their lands are protected, that's flourishing in the marketplace. That value is flourishing in the marketplace right now. And the finance sector can help so much with this right now, right? Especially with new projects where there's nothing to sell other than the idea. And the finance sector can influence what kind of an idea is that? How is that idea likely to be operating in the market in the years ahead?
Great. Thank you so much for that. And I think you both touched on so many important pieces. I want to come back to the well, first a clarification, because we've had a question about which I love the question, just saying, sorry, it's basic, but has a standard been developed for this or not? So just to clarify, what we've developed is a framework that has principles that Haruko outlined, and then that's supported by additional criteria, and that the way that those will be used is the recommendation that standard systems consider those principles and criteria as they are building in the requirements for their standard and the other components of their standard system. So, for example, we heard about assurance. So it provides a framework that should then be applied by each standards, like referenced and applied by each standard system as is appropriate for them. And I'll signpost to the next section where we're going to talk about next steps, where we're going to talk about how Responsible Steel and how IRMA are both going to apply these frameworks. So I want to come back just as we were touching on some of the questions around finance and around boards. And there's an interesting question that I think I'll start with Annie, but others may want to go ahead with, which is about ratings companies and thinking about the extent to which you know, the ESG ratings companies such as MSCI or Sustainalytics have, or what role can they play in supporting a just transition?
Yeah, it's such a great question. Aimee, are you okay if I go first on this one? Because I think you know, the likes of MSCI, Sustainalytics, Vigeo, Iris, they have an important role to play here, and they have perhaps transformed the whole business of sustainable and responsible investing over the last few decades. But there's quite a distinction, I think, to be drawn between a system like MSCI, Sustainalytics, and schemes like Responsible Steel and IRMA. Because when an investor is presented with information from one of those ratings agencies, yes, the data should have been validated by the company as part of the process, but it's only data. It's only a company's claims or what's been in the media. When you receive data on the extent to which a company's operations have been assured or certified against a standard and a multi-stakeholder standard with a high integrity system, you know that that data has actually been independently audited, or it rests on the basis of a rigorous independent audit. And therefore, I think it goes a lot deeper in terms of looking at how well those risks are managed. So I think in terms of the quality of information, what I'd love to see is the likes of IRMA, of MSCI and Sustainalytics actually adopting voluntary sustainability standards as kind of KPIs within their frameworks, so that they're actually they're asking the companies to reinforce data on what percentage of your production facilities have actually been assured or certified against an international multi-stakeholder standard. And that would give the investor really robust information. And obviously, once the investor knows that, there's a lot more information they can mine from that assurance or certification, as both organizations here have a lot of that data on their website. But so I think there is a definite role for these schemes, but I think they could use the data that we can provide as sustainability systems and certification schemes to complement and provide more depth and rigor.
Did you want to add to that, Aimee? Thanks,
I'd
Annie.
love to. Yeah, thank you, Annie. And I think the piece I'd add to it is that, I mean, our standards can be long. IRMA often gets that feedback, right? It's 25 chapters for what's happening at a mine site. Here's water, here's biodiversity, here's indigenous rights, here's protecting worker health and safety and worker rights, a whole range, right? So there's an inclination at times, like, how do we simplify and shorten the list? But I think we see that these are complex operations, and it can be dangerous to cherry pick and say, let's only talk about, you know, decarbonisation and GHG, right? Or we're only going to talk about biodiversity, but don't look over here at, is the water clean? What's happening with workers on the ground? So I really encourage also these systems that are gathering this information to allow what is complex to be complex. It can be complex but beautiful. I often say that about my phone. It's complex, but it is beautiful. It does all these wonderful things for me. Is that let's make sure as these efforts to bring these things together, weave them together, don't lose some of the real impacts of these issues, or we lose our opportunity to deal with risks, which are these real issues for people on the ground and the workers who are there. So I think also someone said on here, I see in the questions about not using the word certification, which IRMA doesn't use certification as much, we're scoring. I think I want to also say that in this moment right now, the steel and the mining sectors, as we said at the beginning, are going through so much change that it can be a disincentive and a barrier to set expectations too high. And I know that probably sounds, like something crazy that I'm saying. Why wouldn't I want high expectations? I love high expectations, but most mining and steel processing right now are probably not going to come out with some green check that's going to make everyone comfortable and say it's all best practice. It's really hard work to do. It comes with tremendous impacts, and the legal and market incentives have not been there for consistent best practice. We need to support companies right now who, no matter where they are in their journey in environmental and social responsibility, to have an incentive for transparency. Here's our real context. Here's the challenges we face. This is 25-year-old operation, right? 40-year-old operation, 10-year-old operation, right? And here's the geochemistry, here's the politics, here's the social context and the challenges we face. And start from that transparency and challenges and create value for improvement from there. Because we have too many companies who feel like, why should I even come in? It's just going to be exposing all of the risks and the hazards I face. And it's time for us to support those companies to expose, to find value and transparency, and the asset managers, finance sector, customers of mining and steel can really create that value that says, we don't need you to be perfect. We just really want to know what the impacts and risks are so we can help you invest in improving.
Thanks so much, Aimee. I think it actually kind of takes a step, offers a nice bridge to the next question, which I'll hand to Davitso on, which is talking about that broken, mistrustful environment and how we think that voluntary sustainability standard systems and others can best bridge the gap between the diverse views of the stakeholder groups.
Yes, yeah. So voluntary standards can actually play a role in repairing broken trust. And that takes us back to the governance models that we've been speaking about. What type of governance do voluntary sustainability standards have? Because this is very critical. If it's inclusive, transparent, and representative, then stakeholders, build trust starting from there. But what is also more important is that voluntary standards create spaces where stakeholders are respected, they are heard, and they can influence decisions. This might mean slowing down some of the processes enough to rebuild the trust, moving at the speed of trust, like we say in IRMA. So that is also very important. And as we have been talking about, it is also about being genuine. It is also about being inclusive, being transparent, and being meaningful. And I think when all this is combined, there is an opportunity to build broken trust between companies and stakeholders, or amongst stakeholders themselves.
Great, thanks, Davitso. I love that expression. I don't know if I've heard it before, but moving at the speed of trust. It makes perfect sense, and it really does underline how sustainability standard systems work, actually, in that consensus building approach of setting a standard. I'm just looking at the time, and I think we're going to have to move on. There's one or two other points in the questions which we'll try to write responses for, but I want to make sure that we cover the next steps, because that is one of the questions that came up in the Q&A panel. So I am going to first hand to Haruko to talk about next steps.
Yeah, thank you, Aimee. So I think, yeah, this really presentation is respond to one of the questions that we received. So what is the next? So here I would like to present the immediate next steps for us at Responsible Steel. So currently we are finalizing the Just Transition report, and that will be shared with you around the end of October, or maybe can be at the beginning of November. But we are trying to finalize now this week, and then also going into the designer to be pretty looking and presenting nicely. So that version will be shared with you shortly. And then, I'm sorry. Sorry, go back. So, sorry. And currently we are forming the working group on just transition topics. So we are going through the revision process at Responsible Steel. And what we try to do is looking at a current existing principle to build on our standards, to add and incorporate some of our recommendation into our standard. So we are forming the working group as I speak. And in this process, we have a multi-stakeholder settings to discuss about what we should be included in the standard. And then also later this year, we're going to have a public consultation for 2 months, 60 days. So where you can also provide input into our revision standard, which includes the set of new requirement on just transition. And then later we're gonna develop the tools and then guidance, but that comes a bit later. But your input and then feedback is always welcome. So if you are not part of the working group, you are always having the open channel to provide your input to us. So please fine tune with us, and also give opportunity to provide feedback to us in the coming months or so.
Thanks, Haruko. And Davito, how will IRMA take this forward?
Yeah, so for us, I think the heavy lifting starts now. So the work will be transforming looking at the insights that we got, the learnings that we got into practical actions. And the one action that we have already started doing is that Aimee is currently seeking expert advisors on climate action. And this is part of our standard review process. I think, Haruko, you can move on to the slide on the standard review process. And what it really means is that the expert advisors on climate action, which is going to delve quite deeper into just transitions, they'll be starting from where we left. So they'll, look at the report, look at the gaps that were identified, and use that momentum to propel them forward, carry the lessons, and then provide input into what will go into the standard. So as you can see, we revising the standard, and the standard is out for public comment until the 22nd of October, and would encourage you to provide comments to that. And in addition to that, we are also going to be using the lessons that we have learned and the insights that we got to continue strengthening the standard, and also to respond to the challenges that we heard from workers, from communities and Indigenous rights holders and other stakeholders. And additionally, Aimee is also going to be developing auditor training on just transitions, and enhance this through roundtable discussions with auditors, looking at the methodology, providing them capacity and building the capacity so that they are able to audit quite effectively and build their expertise as they audit the topic of just transition. And lastly, we are going to be maintaining open and inclusive dialogue, because that is also very important, because we are going to continue to learn as just transition is evolving. We think that the learning starts now, and will continue to be inclusive, to be open, and to be transparent.
Great, thank you, Davito. So lots of opportunities, and here's just how to comment on the IRMA standard. I'm sure this is all over the IRMA website as well, but we will be circulating the recording, and the information will be there. Okay, so we're nearly at time. So just to wrap up, I just really wanted to thank all of the people that have helped to shape the journey that we've been on together. Obviously everyone in the team, but of course all of the stakeholders that we have engaged with, which has been a huge diversity of stakeholders. Throughout the interviews and workshops, we heard a number of recurring messages, which we've tried to highlight today. So of course, that piece about keeping justice at the center of transitions. So not using it as an add-on and not really knowing what it means, but actually thinking about it and making a practical commitment to protecting rights, promoting equity, and making sure that all groups are benefiting from the changes, which reminds us that every transition is, whether it's decarbonisation, technology, etc., is very context specific, and that the solutions, both at the standards level, considering the sectors, but also at the application of the just transition concepts, must be shaped with local realities in mind, and thinking about those context specific applications. We heard there's no shortage of frameworks, commitments, declarations, etc. But what is missing, and what we've tried to help provide a framework to support, is how to deliver effective, timely, and inclusive implementation. We heard stakeholders calling for stronger inclusive governance of transition processes, more meaningful and ongoing social dialogue, and greater investment in skills development and social protection. We also heard of the importance of looking beyond the individual sites or assets and taking a value chain view of impacts and opportunities, and so much more. So our two project objectives were to identify the role that standards can play towards a socially responsible transition in heavy industries, such as steel and mining, and to identify an agreed approach, framework, or set of principles to take forward. So with the findings, I think we've really shown how in the different components of a standard system, whether that's the standard, the assurance, the stakeholder engagement, the governance, and so on, there really is a role for us to play in ensuring socially responsible transitions, helping to bridge that gap between commitment and practice, and providing a structure and a framework for this action, which then offers the means to verify progress. We obviously hold very dearly multi-stakeholder governance, but the findings really showed the importance of that as not just a procedural step, but a way of ensuring that decisions are credible, balanced, and supported by the stakeholders that are involved. And then, of course, we did set out the agreed framework and set of principles, not a standard in itself, but something to be referred to and to incorporate into our standards. So just to close, I really want to express our appreciation to the ICL Innovations Fund and the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs for their support in making this work possible. So this started with a joint application to the ICL Innovations Fund last year that kicked everything off. So without their support, this work wouldn't have been possible. And we really want to thank every stakeholder who shared their experience, their concerns, their ideas, their time. A full day workshop is a huge commitment, and we got so much out of them, as well as the interviews and feedback that we received. And so really just want to thank you again for that. And lastly, to thank the panelists for joining us today, and of course, to all of you for joining us today to hear, and for your great questions, both in the run-up and on the call today. So thank you, everyone. And we will be circulating the recording tomorrow.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Davica. Thank you, Haruka.
Bye. Thank you so much, Aimee.
Thank you, everyone.
Aimee.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.